Hello. We're going to have a conversation, and you're invited. You're invited to listen to us talk and to think about this whole question of your life and stories. And our focus is there, but it's wherever things may go. And so that may take you to a different place as well. So my partner today is Juliana Dunn, and Juliana is a college student at Middlebury College.
That's right.
And she's been involved with a very interesting experience, an internship.
That's right.
So you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and about that?
Sure. So this summer, I'm an art history student at Middlebury, going into my junior year. And this summer, I got to be a part of a program called Museum Works, which is also through the college. And it's an experience that involves professional development as well as the practical kind of internship component. Mm-hmm. So Mondays, we get to spend doing professional development or traveling to different museums. We went to Boston, we went to Williamstown, and there are 7 of us in total interns at different institutions. I'm at the Vermont Folk Life Center. There's someone at the Henry Sheldon Museum, someone at the Armstrong Science Library who's actually working with really old physics tools, which are really cool, doing archival research and things. He probably has some good stories too. And then 4 at the College Museum of Art. So I landed at the Vermont Folk Life Center, which has been really fun, mostly because I get to do just about everything or anything that I kind of have an interest in. So I've gotten to learn about video production, audio production. I did some exhibition design. It's kind of been all over the map, which has been really lovely for me. Yeah.
So how did your interest in art get started, and where does that go back to?
Yeah, I'm originally from Houston, and my senior year of high school, I had a really wonderful teacher who taught art history, and I loved the class. And then graduated, decided I was coming to mid, but I came as a Feb, so I needed to figure out something to do with my semester off. And so I started thinking, because previously in high school I'd worked at a community radio station, so I had a little bit of audio experience. Tried to work at a local NPR station, but they weren't really hiring people outside University of Houston. So I ended up emailing the Minnell Collection in Houston, which is a mostly contemporary arts museum, and just said, hey, I have these audio skills. I'm interested in art history. I'd love to maybe put together some form of an internship and work on some projects for y'all. And they actually jumped on it. They said, yes, please. They had a new digital media manager. So she was looking to kind of expand into podcasting and things like that. So I got to go on and tell the stories of objects, which was really fun, and exhibitions. So that's how I got started. And then once I was at that museum, I just loved the environment so much. The people, the quiet of walking in through art in the morning before the museum's open at all, and then going into the back offices and things like that. And so then I was like, yep, that's what I'm going to study. I'm going to study art history.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. And that's been your conviction for quite some time now.
Yeah. I mean, I guess.
So how did this
years,
experience here? What kind of stories were you working on this summer?
So one of the stories I'm working on right now, which is in part, it's kind of a retelling almost. That's what some of the research at the Folk Life Center is about, going back into the archives and kind of reviving things. But one project I'm working on right now is a podcast, and it's about the Rainbow Cattle Co., which was, or is actually, I think, a bar in Putney, Vermont, and they do a lot of drag shows on the weekends. A photographer named Evie Lovett followed 6 or 7 drag queens, I want to say, took photos, was invited into the dressing room and to performances and things like that. And you really, through the photographs and some of the audio clips, you kind of get to know, from the online exhibition, you get to know the drag queens a little bit. You get to know how they got started, what interests them, things like that. But you don't get a full kind of arc of how the project kind of evolved. And so I'm putting together a podcast in which Ned sat down with Ned, who is the director of the Vision and Voice Gallery at the Vermont Folk Life Center. He sat down with Evie Lovett again and just kind of talked about how she got started on this project and had her talk about the different queens and her experiences with them and things like that. So that's kind of what weaves in and out through the audio we already have, which is really wonderful, of them talking about their art.
So is this project, what's the stage? Is it done? Going to be done?
Getting close.
Will be done?
Getting close.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been editing last week, this week, and we're getting close. We're going to go back into the archives to find, Ned thinks we have a tape of one of the performances, so I will want to take some of the audio from that and perhaps weave it in with what we already have to make some smoother transitions and things. But this is a podcast they hope to launch in September, and there will be a series of them, so coming out either monthly or every other week or so, which will be fun. Yeah.
So let me ask you to do a little bit in definition.
Sure.
We don't know who's out there in our conversations, and that's exciting.
Yeah.
That's really, and I go to the grocery store sometimes and people say, I saw you on television. And I said, oh my, that's my one chance to be a television star.
That's right.
No, I was trying to be more humble than that. But I heard the other day, the definition about digital falls into two categories. There are those who are natives, and then there are those who are immigrants. And anybody who's older and who remembers mechanical typewriters,
sure,
or Selectra 3, where they thought the balls being exchanged was that's as great as technology is going to get. So just say a little bit about what's a podcast, and
what's a podcast,
how do people connect with it, so forth.
Sure.
Okay.
So a podcast, it's not very different at all from something you might hear on the radio, like a program like This American Life. Really any program that's on the radio could also be made as a podcast. So people tend to connect with it through different platforms. So it'll be linked on the website. It'll be on, there's a website called Stitcher, iTunes, different places you can subscribe to a certain podcast so that it comes into your queue every week. So for example, I listen to, the New York Times has a podcast called The Daily. That's just kind of a daily update of things that are going on and goes more into depth on a certain story each day. And so every morning when I open my phone and go to my podcast app, there it is, and I can click play and listen.
So is a podcast basically something you listen to and engage in? What is it when it becomes interactive, so that you who are listening can somehow respond? So what is that? Is that a podcast?
I guess there are live radio shows that you can call in, and I think that's not quite the same, because a podcast, once it's produced, it's not live. It's done.
Not live. It's a finished product.
It is a finished product, but since they're often weekly, even daily, they tend to kind of grow their own audiences and their own kind of communities. So many listeners may comment on a certain podcast, or often hosts will solicit responses from audience members, and they'll send in whatever they want to talk about.
In another day, there was a man by the name of Gene Shepard, and Gene Shepard would do a radio show, and it would be late at night, and it really had people staying up at night listening to a radio show on a little plastic radio, so which says there's excitement here.
Yeah.
And you're very excited about what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so, is this where the path you're going to pursue? Or
I think I'll always keep audio with me. I really like that as a medium. When I was a kid, my mom always had the radio on. She was always listening to NPR in the car, in the kitchen, or whatever. And I think that's one of the most engaging mediums because you can really be immersed in it. You can be painting, you can be cleaning the bathroom floor and be listening to audio and be totally transported, which I think is really lovely. And it's something that you can do both actively and passively. So it can follow you while you're cooking, and you can be paying attention one moment, and then if you decide to check out for a bit, it'll be right there for you again.
Okay.
But
so it can be both well prepared and scripted, or it could be improvisation.
Sure.
That's what Gene Shepherd's was.
Really? It was improv?
Yes,
Oh,
very
that's
much
fun.
improv.
Oh.
Rambling. Oh, yes. If you look that up in history.
Okay, I will.
So, photography, is that
Photography? Photography, I'm very much a novice photographer. I'm kind of like any other...
You feel so good.
I'm kind of like any other college student. I have my phone and I take pictures with my phone. That's about it.
Right.
But I'm more interested in pursuing, hopefully, museum work. I'd love to one day be a curator or museum director or something like that. But audio production is something I'll definitely keep with me.
Okay.
That's something I enjoy.
That's great. So, where does this all go back to in your experience as a child? I mean, where were the stories in your life, and who told the stories? Were you a storyteller, or were you a listener? You know?
I think I was both.
Both,
Sure. Yeah. So I have a little sister who's 2.5 years younger, and so when we were kids, we would often, play pretend, make up stories. We had this little, speaking of photography, we had this little camera. I don't know how old we were when we had this, but it was a little video camera, and we still have some of the videos from this.
Oh my!
But because I grew up in Houston, but my mom's family is in Pennsylvania and my dad's family is in Vermont. So we would come up in the summers to visit both families sometimes, and we always wanted to kind of take the atmosphere back and show our friends, because we're like, we go to Pennsylvania and Vermont, it's very exciting.
Yeah.
So
that's a long ways from Houston.
Yeah, it is. So we would have like our daily news shows. My sister would be the anchor for the show and then tell about whatever was going on that day, and I would take videos. And then we also had house tours. We called it, my little sister's name is Sophie, and we called it House Tours with Sophie. And she would give a tour of our grandparents' house.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so we did our own little different types of storytelling, but my dad definitely did a lot of storytelling too. He was really great about bedtime stories and things like that. When I was little, he made up stories about Rex the fire dog, because
Rex the fire dog.
Yes, I was very into dogs. Still love dogs.
Yeah.
But I had a lot of rules because I was a very particular little kid. I had nightmares a lot. So there's certain rules about the Rex the fire dog stories, that they could not be. There were no ladder trucks allowed to be involved, because that might involve heights. They couldn't be rescued. There couldn't be fires on a bridge because people could fall into the water and different things. My sister, on the other hand, was happy to have chaos in her stories. So if I sat in, especially when I was a little bit older and she was more the listener, some of those stories got more wild. So yeah.
So do you remember some of the Rex the fire dog stories your father?
Oh, I don't know. They had their typical arc. Rex the fire dog was a Dalmatian and would go and save people. But I can't really remember exactly. I just remember the stories being there.
But just was your father animated?
Oh yes, for sure. Yeah.
So,
and we used to also around bedtime. I love Dr. Seuss and did as a kid too. So he would do animated tellings of Dr. Seuss books and things.
Now, for him, was that coming out of his work? or was that sort of the other side of his life?
Oh yeah, no, definitely more the other side of his life. He's a geologist.
Oh, okay.
So more the scientist than anything else.
Right.
But he could tell a good story.
Okay.
Yeah. And I remember when kind of talking more about my dad being quite the scientist. When my sister and I won these little goldfish at a festival, he had us set up. We were only allowed to keep them if we made it kind of a science learning experience. So he set up a spreadsheet where we'd go and we'd measure the pH of the water and different things. So we were allowed to keep the goldfish then.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, so he combined the storytelling and the things that you would learn in school, or maybe you wouldn't learn in school.
Sure.
But you would learn it with your father, because
absolutely.
he could find a way to do it in in animation.
Yeah.
And that's great.
Very much so.
So when did it become clear to you that you really were caught up in the art world? Or the artistic expression?
Sure. It was not something that I always have liked to write a lot. And I thought for most of high school, I thought that was more my area of interest, that I might want to be a journalist or a writer of some sort. But really it was that time between high school and college where I had to kind of sit back and think about what my interests were, and what I wanted to do in the future. And having a semester off, I was just staying. My dad now lives in an apartment an hour north of Houston in Spring, and so I was staying with him. And he was gone during the day, for work. And before I figured out exactly what a job or anything like that, I had a lot of time to kind of sit around and think. So I realized I was pretty passionate about art history, and I think the stories of objects really intrigues me, because you can look at something and through formal analysis you can get pretty deep into it, but then you add the element of history and everything is so much richer and exciting.
Was that you mentioned that title before, objects, so was that an ongoing experience for you? I mean, or was that just something like it was focused at one point into a particular project, but it became a way of looking at
at the world, kind of. Yeah. I think starting out in art history classes in high school, you learn some basic things about even just like columns, like the different orders. So you have Doric, which is very up and down, and then you have Ionic, which is the little swirls, and you have Corinthian, which is swirls plus like some fauna or something like that. And once you knew those orders, all of a sudden you started looking around, and everywhere you just see columns, and you're like, oh, now I can name these columns, and I can tell you a little bit about what they say about the building and who built it and why they built it. Because if it's Ionic, then, or Doric rather, it's more, it's pared down, meant to be more down to earth. If it's Corinthian, it's got to be quite fancy and things like that. So it's, just learning different things like that. And then, if you get into different parts of art history, you start to see things a little differently. It's really fun. Yeah.
Well, what have been some of the stories you've been working on during this internship with the Folk Life Center?
The Folk Life Center?
Yeah.
So the Rainbow Calico is one. Another project that we've been working on is called Growing Food, Growing Farmers. And that's really interesting. There's a hub of kind of, I guess, developing farmers in Rutland, around Rutland. And there's this one farm who, and I can't remember the man's name. I think his name is Greg, though, and he's really helped to kind of help young farmers grow and learn how to grow and things like that. And so that's a collection of stories in photographs and in audio of farmers who have been in the business for a while, who have been growing different grapes, and farmers who are just getting their start, who are either just out of high school, just out of college, talking about how they discovered that they really love the outdoors. You know, some people came from cities and said they never had this experience growing up, and suddenly they found solace in the outdoors, and this is the life they want to lead. Others who are more interested in the market side of things, farmers markets and partnerships with vineyards across the nation, whatever, you know. So it's a lot of different stories in one. Yeah.
Really good exhibits show up at the Vermont Folk Life Center.
For sure.
When I first moved here, one of their key points of interest and concern was to capture the stories of the older people in Vermont, and to make sure that they don't get lost.
Yeah.
The people who were farmers during the hard time and all that. And I've always, that was my first admiration for the Vermont Folk Life Center.
Yeah.
So, do you see yourself becoming a producer then? And as well as, you mentioned a whole number of things there.
I could see myself. I think I want to always keep making things, whatever I do. And whether that's an official title somewhere or something that I kind of do within a job or even just for myself, it's something I'd like to continue to do.
If you were to say to the people who are in our massive audience out there, why it's important for them to try to get in touch with stories and to tell stories, what would you say to them?
I think stories tell us a little bit about who we are and who we want to be. The stories we tell kind of reflect what we're thinking about in that moment and what's been on our minds for years, perhaps. And I think that's why it's important. It's a way to get in touch with where you're coming from and where you're going.
And you want to be a part of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay.
And so are there stories that you particularly that you would like, if you were offered here's a time to do a project, is there something, and you can do whatever you want,
sure.
You know?
Yeah.
So is there something, some of the things there that you might want to do?
So there's actually a project that I have been given an opportunity to kind of get started. And it will be working hopefully with the Latinx community, so in Vermont, and helping them tell their own stories. So not necessarily, definitely not trying to be anybody's voice, but making those Vermonters visible to one another in a more apparent way. And I'm going to be working with my friend who's a photographer, perhaps, but it's really going to be an open-ended project to kind of approach the community and say, you know, what stories would you guys like to tell? Because I now have a connection to this space at the Folk Life Center that is dedicated to that. And whether, you know, people want it to be a community arts project or a podcasting project or a portraiture project, whatever it may be, there are lots of different ways to tell those stories. And I'd like to help those Vermonters tell their stories.
So if you said they have a designated space for that.
Yeah, I mean the vision.
What does that mean?
The Vision and Voice Gallery at the Vermont Folk Life Center is really all about the core mission of the Folk Life Center, which is to make Vermonters visible to other Vermonters. And Ned is, as the director, has done a really wonderful job at making that space open for whomever has interest. that fits into that mission. So that's the space, yeah.
Okay, good. And so that becomes ongoing. And so while you're in college and maybe beyond?
Yeah, I mean, definitely while I'm in college. We'll see beyond, hopefully grad school is in the works for me, which may be more West Coast because I want to study Latin American art history.
Okay.
But at least I've got, 2 more years here. I'm going to make the most of them.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Latin American art history.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that coming out of living in Houston? Or?
Yeah, I think definitely in part. Also, I started taking Spanish when I was in 7th grade or so, I've continued with that. And also that's kind of the art that interests me the most. I think definitely it's in part the sense of place in Houston and like the different communities I got to interact with and be around that kind of sparked my interest there. But yeah, it's sometimes
exciting.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard to say. Everybody has to kind of choose a field within a field. Sometimes, if you're going, a more specialized direction, it's interesting to see how people choose. I'm not 100% sure how I chose.
So, do you know what your
sometimes.
senior project will be? You don't have to tell.
I don't know. I don't know.
No,
I will
okay.
have to write a thesis, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I am going to spend a semester in Mexico this coming spring. So maybe I'll get to do some research there that will lead into a senior project of some sort, but very open-ended. Everything's very open-ended at this point.
I have really admired some senior projects at the college. I have been able to see the results as they're being presented, and just it's a great matter of affirmation, I think.
Sure.
One of the things we try to do in our little storytelling experience is to encourage people to be part, to tell the story. Often what happens, people will say, I don't have a story to tell. And we say, that's fine, because listening comes first. Without someone to listen, maybe you don't have a story, or you're talking to yourself, and there are concerns about that when people talking to themselves. But it's an exciting thing to realize that our world is always moving, and we're always invited to be a part of this, to tell our story.
Yeah.
I particularly like the project that was done recently by the Folk Life Center. With the Open Door Clinic, telling the stories of the migrant farm workers.
Yeah, the Golden Cage. That's right. Yeah.
That was really a good project.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing I'd like to expand upon, because that was a little had a kind of journalistic focus in some ways in framing it. You had the dairy farm workers, and then you had the farm owners. And I want to expand that kind of...
And the comedians. I didn't know that there was a comedic movement in Vermont.
Right.
Well, it's been delightful to spend this time.
Yeah,
and
thank you for having me.
We trust you'll have a great 2 years here and beyond, as part of telling the story. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Okay.